Hello, I'm Katrina Matheson, and I am giving a guest lecture today on schooling and childcare in Canada for HREQ 1800 Justice for Children. I am move to the next slide. I am a PhD student, PhD candidate actually, in science and technology studies. My focus is in critical AI studies and science diplomacy. I'm sure you're wondering, how does that relate to education? Well, you'll find out in a moment. But basically, if you don't know, if you're not familiar with science and technology studies or STS, basically it's a branch of social science that emerges from critical theory that really became popular in the 1970s. And it was really rooted in the idea that the practice of science is not purely objective. Um, STS theorists have advanced concepts broadly across disciplines. For example, one of them being social constructionism, which obviously we talked about a lot in this class. STS, scholarship really, was really instrumental in what's called the ontological turn in the social sciences that really put forward the idea that different things can have different meanings in different contexts. Okay, this is my fourth year TAing Justice for Children. I think it's an amazing course, and I'm really glad to be here. I happen to be American. I'm from Los Angeles, and I have two kids who are currently in the TDSB Toronto schools. And as a parent in Toronto, I've been organizing other parents, mostly in the city, but also, hopefully expanding a little bit throughout the province, around the need for more education funding. And I've been doing that for about the last year and a half. So, presently I have about 800 parents on my email list. But this was an article that I had a quote featured in, actually in the headline, and the subheadline last March. It was around the budgeting process. And yeah, I mean, I really do, I do believe that Ontario schools are in, and really maybe schools across Canada are in an educational crisis. And I think this deserves a lot more attention than it's getting. Okay, so just a quick outline. I'm going to give an overview of education in Canada at the both federal and provincial levels. In the provincial side, I'm going to talk about a brief history to the best of my knowledge about the state of education in in Ontario, and just some things that I think people should be aware of about what the Auditor General is saying, some student deaths that have happened recently, and then, really where we go from here. I'm going to talk a bit about education theory and history, most of which comes from the Albanese book that we've been studying in this course. And then I'm going to conclude with sort of the section on childcare. So moving from schooling to childcare, and then give a conclusion. Okay, so first of all, education in Canada in terms of federal obligations. The Constitution Act of 1867 is the provision of the Constitution of Canada that gives provinces the jurisdiction over education. So there is no federal mandate for education. There's no guarantee of funding. There's no curricular standards. There's no teacher training standards or performance measures. It is all handled at the provincial level. Okay. Another document that can relate to education is called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is the Constitution Act of 1982. In this charter, every citizen in Canada is given the right to vote. Notice it doesn't exclude children per se. And it also says that every individual is equal before the law, right? So people have a right not to be discriminated against on any race, national origin, color, religion, sex, etc. Oops. There is a protection of minority education rights in the charter. It says that people who speak a minority language, either French or English, wherever that applies, do have a right to be instructed in their language, which is really an interesting thing that that's the only explicit educational related protection in the charter. I say that because education, I find, from talking to a lot of parents, I find that the French programs are really lacking. It seems like they don't have the teachers that they need, the qualified teachers. The state of French education, I think, is a really a major problem. So it's interesting that even with its protections, that is not, there's not a lot of attention or prioritization of it, it seems. So when I talk to, particularly elected officials, but even just other parents about education in Canada, and I bring my experience coming from the States, mostly I'm frankly disappointed with a lot of the aspects of education here that I've encountered so far. People tend to have a really favorable, even if they have experienced things that they don't like about the education system in general, they assume that the education system overall is good in comparison to other places in the world. I don't think that that's necessarily true. And I would say that even in the Albanese book, Albanese really talks about, she really presents the picture in a favorable light, right? She cites these statistics that are pretty positive. Canada has one of the most highly educated populations in the world, presumably in terms of how many people receive, high school diplomas or undergraduate diplomas. In 2016, we had a school enrollment rate that was the highest among the OECD states. So that means that we're really good at enrolling kids in school. We're really good at keeping kids in school. I mean, that's very positive. That really is. We also have a very high graduation rate, 93.9%. That's uniquely high. And our rates of post-secondary education are among the highest also of OECD nations. So while those are all good things that Albanese is calling out, none of them speak to the quality of the education that's being delivered, which I think is really an important thing to focus on. So I find that, when I look at certain other statistics, they're really telling a completely different story. So for example, I took from UNICEF. They had a report card that they did in 2020. So out of those 38 OECD member states, Canada actually ranks 18th for education achievement and skills development. So certainly not near the top. Almost 1 in 3 young people does not have basic math skills by age 15. Canada ranks 19th in the number of children in pre-K 1 year before primary education begins. So, right at the middle. And we rank 20th for ensuring all kids receive support and inclusion at school. We rank 33rd for the prevention of violence against kids and 35th for child mental health. Canada has a pretty high teen suicide rate, which I think, is why we have that designation. And Canada ranks 30th overall for the well-being of children, which, again, for being one of the wealthier states, that seems disappointing. Here's a little infographic from UNICEF. So it shows in their report card, Netherlands was ranked first, Chile was ranked 38th, and Canada was right here at 30th. This campaign was called Worlds Apart, and the idea was that Canada is really worlds apart, or kids in Canada are worlds apart from other rich kids in other rich countries. I don't know. It doesn't seem like there was much attention on that campaign. There wasn't any press coverage that I could find. So this is really an issue that it seems to be quite ignored. Okay, so again, true or false? But Canada ranks well internationally, right? Despite all this, we still rank in the top 10. We have one of the best education systems in the world. Okay, well, we do rank in the top 10 in terms of the international rankings on the international tests. But I would not call it one of the best systems in the world. There are some really significant caveats, and I want to share with you the Canada's performance on the what's called the PISA exam, the international exam administered by the OECD. So between 2000 and 2022, so there's 3 sections of the test: reading, math, and science. And you can see the trend here. The trend is downward. Science is holding up the best, but still declining. And then here we have math, which is doing significantly worse than reading. Both are bad. Reading went from 500, the average score being 534 in reading in 2000 to 507 in 2022. Math went from 532 to 497, and science went from 534 to 515. Also, alongside the PISA exam, the principals also take a survey. And in that 2022 survey, they found that 44% of students in Canada attended schools whose principals reported that the school's capacity to provide instruction was hindered by a lack of teaching staff. So they're not staffed appropriately, is what it sounds like, in almost half of Canadian schools. That seems extremely alarming. And 24% reported, or 24% of students are at schools that have inadequate or poorly qualified teaching staff. Okay, that's alarming on its own. But then when you look at 2018, those same percentages were 19% for the lack of staff and 7% for inadequate or poorly trained staff. So in 4 years, the number of Canadian 15-year-old students affected by teacher shortages has more than doubled. And by underqualified teaching has more than tripled. So that's very alarming. I'm sure some of that has to do with COVID, but regardless, this should be, really a national emergency that needs to be dealt with. It's, if the schools aren't properly staffed, then the kids are not going to properly learn. By the way, I wrote teacher shortage, but it's not really clear if it's a matter of shortage or a matter of the positions actually being cut. Okay, so here's comparative outcomes, okay? So mean performance in mathematics by international quintiles of socioeconomic status. Okay, so here's Canada. So this means that this large circle, that's the percentage of students that are in the top 20% of the socioeconomic status within Canada, right? I actually don't know if that's within Canada or within the world, but obviously Canada, this circle is quite big. It's bigger in Canada than it is for Estonia or Japan. This top quintile, that means, there's more advantaged students in Canada than in those other 2 countries. But still, it looks like the average Canadian student in math is scoring, it looks like around 525. But in Estonia, for example, it's closer to 550. And in Japan, it is closer, it looks like about 575. So, even though we have the most advantage, or, a high proportion of advantaged students, they're not performing as well as they are in some other wealthy nations. If you take Estonia specifically, and there's a reason why I want to compare Canada and Estonia, I will come back to it later. But if you take these different quintiles in Canada and Estonia respectively, the students in Estonia are, by socioeconomic status, they are performing about 20 points higher than our Canadian students in the same socioeconomic group. And then at the very bottom, they're performing about 25 points higher, right? So you could say that, at least in terms of, educational skill development, the most disadvantaged students in Canada are worse off, significantly worse off than the most disadvantaged students in Estonia, whereas the most advantaged students in Canada are not doing as well as they are in Estonia. Okay, again, remember this example of Canada and Estonia. Okay, so now, again, digging on the OECD website, right? The student performance in Canada, I came across some really interesting footnotes that actually I didn't find in some of the published reports. They were just online, the online indicators. So what I found was this. It says in Canada, compared to attending public school, the difference in math performance associated with attendance at private school is among the largest of the OECD and partner countries and economies after accounting for students' schools and socioeconomic profiles. Okay, this is really significant. This is saying that for as, whatever the scores were showing, whatever the outcomes were showing, if you broke down those scores by public school students and private school students, the disparity between those two types of students is among the highest of the OECD countries. Okay. So you've got Mexico in there, you've got Chile, you've got countries in Eastern Europe, right? Still the disparity in Canada is greater. There's more inequity in the education system between public and private in Canada than in these other countries. Okay, that's what that's saying. And it says here 28 PISA score points. So let's say that you had a neighbor, you had the similar family profiles, similar family incomes. One student was in public school, one student is in private school. In math, the private school student is going to score 28 points higher than his neighbor. Okay, that's really, really significant. And if you look at I think I saved this on the next slide, okay, I'll get to that. So here's another grouping of footnotes that I found. I'm going to start with the bottom footnote here. Okay, it says in mathematics, the average difference in performance between immigrant and non-immigrant students was 12 points in favor of immigrant students, a significant difference. After accounting for students' socioeconomic profile, a significant difference of 16 score points in favor of immigrant students was observed. Okay, reflect on that for a moment. That means that the immigrant students are scoring 12 points higher. Like immigrant students and Canadian-born students of similar economic backgrounds, the average difference is going to be 12 points in favor of the immigrant student. After accounting for socioeconomics, the difference is 16 points in favor of the immigrant student. So that means that even coming from the poorest countries, those newcomer students are outperforming our Canadian-born students by a significant number of points. So that's really significant. And then if we go back to this middle bullet point here, the share of immigrant students has increased in Canada to 34%. Yeah, this is a bit misleading because I guess maybe I think in this number they must be including first and second generation. But then it specifies 16% of 15-year-olds were first generation immigrants, so they were born elsewhere. So that's really interesting because the students who are born elsewhere or have parents who are born elsewhere score so much higher than our Canadian-born students. And there's 34% of them that are in that category. That means that however well we're performing on this test in mathematics, our scores in Canada are really being buoyed by these immigrant students. So I would say the most striking discrepancy in Canadian test scores appears to be the difference between public school and private school students. This is the example I gave. Two students from the same neighborhood, they're going to have a 28-point difference in math. And what I found was that the raw score difference is actually unadjusted for socioeconomics is actually closer to 50 points. Okay, 50 points difference. And it just, so let's say two students from the same town, but one is very affluent and one is very poor. They're going to have a 50-point difference, which is an incredible difference. Canada has maintained a relatively high ranking overall, right? Ranking 8th in reading and 9th in math internationally. But 34% of our test takers are immigrants, and those immigrants are outperforming Canadian-born test takers in math by 16 points. So that unadjusted score suggests that even the poorest newcomer students are significantly outperforming Canadian-born students in math. So my conclusion on this, after looking at all this data, is that because there's no federal mandate for education, the results of the PISA are easily brushed under the rug. There's no federal education minister to be held responsible, and there's no attention on these scores or these metrics. Okay, moving to provincial obligations for education. The Education Act is the document from 1990, the legislation from 1990 that really sets out the structure for education in the province. It defines the power and responsibilities of the Ministry of Education and as well as the school boards. The Ministry of Education, it wasn't always this way, but presently the Ministry of Education delivers grants to the school boards, and the school boards are then responsible for having good stewardship of those grants and getting the money where they need to go, and ensuring that the quality of education is held to a certain level. That sounds good, but jumping down to this bottom point here, there's no mechanism for the public or even the school boards themselves to challenge how that funding amount has been determined. Okay, so what we have in the case of Ontario, it appears that the funding amounts are fairly arbitrary, and not only is there no way for the public to really hold the ministry accountable for that funding amount, but there's not even a pathway for the trustees themselves to dialogue with the Ministry of Education. This is really terrible, and it's something that needs to be changed. And what's more, let's see if I can move ahead here. Okay. So I'll give you, just to go through the structure of the Ministry of Education. So the Ministry of Education is led as of today, basically this week, by the Honorable Jill Dunlop. She's an MPP from Simcoe North. I don't actually know her background other than the fact that she was the Minister of Universities and Colleges previously. But my understanding is that the Minister of Education does not have to have any particular expertise in education at all. There was an interim Minister of Education that was appointed between June and August of this year. And in the press, it was stated that, or it was suggested that he would resign because not only resigned as minister, but also resigned as MPP, partly because he didn't really want the education portfolio. So what that suggests to me is that actually, not only are these people potentially not particularly qualified, but they may not even want the job. Right? So this is not even, at least in the current administration, this is not even a conversation that's had with the potential ministers. It's literally just an appointment, which again seems a bit strange. So the Ministry of Education has, on one hand, you have the political side, right? The part that's, led by the Minister of Education, the elected MPP. And then you have the civil servant side. The civil servant side, at the top of that is the Deputy Minister of Education. So the previous Deputy Minister of Education was Kate Manson-Smith. She was a career public servant who served in ministries from housing to policy to planning policy to long-term care. So she was not a career educator herself. She was a career public servant, right? And so she bounced between all of these departments, which again, it seems strange to have a ministry and have no one who actually is a career educator, at the top, being at the top of the decision making. Anyway, she was someone who I was actually trying to get a hold of to meet with on behalf of parents. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. She actually retired in August of this year. So a new deputy minister was recently appointed. His name is Bruce Rodriguez. And he does appear to be a career educator. He previously was the director of education for the Toronto Catholic School Board. So we'll see what comes of that. So just a brief history as I understand it. So in the late 1990s, the Harris government, Mike Harris was the premier of Ontario. He began to accelerate the defunding of education. One of the things he did that was significant was take away school board autonomy so that the school boards could no longer raise taxes in order to fund education. I believe there were other changes as well that meant that the funding process became a lot more centralized and a lot more opaque. As a result of cuts from that era, a few years later, the Toronto District School Board trustees voted down a budget, meaning they didn't pass a budget, and that resulted in a provincial takeover of the budgeting process. There's sort of a mixed memory as to how that went down. The institutional kind of conventional wisdom within the trustees seems to be that, it was a horrible experience and no one ever wants that to happen again. But on the side of labor, from their perspective, the supervisor who was appointed did make cuts, but was not able to get to the funding number that the province had originally granted. And so they actually ended up better off by going through that process than they would have, had they just accepted it. So, despite what could be characterized as a win, potentially, relative win, the trustees, they've never gone that route since. They've always passed a budget every year, even though conditions in the classroom are worsening and outcomes are definitely declining, to the point where, according to the CBC, half of Ontario grade 6 students do not meet provincial benchmarks for proficiency in math. Okay, so I was digging around to try and find, spending on education in Canada. I found this number from 2010, so it's a bit old, but the number in 2010 per student was 12,557. That's all across Canada, not just Ontario. From the literature I've been reading, it sounds like Ontario has had relatively low spending levels since that time. We've been sort of chronically low. I couldn't find the detail on Ontario's numbers from that same era, but I did find them obviously for the current year, and the current year is 13,364. So that means that it's a little bit apples to oranges, sorry, but between 2010 and 2021 to 2022, the Ontario funding is only 6.4% higher than what the national average was 14 years ago, right? Meanwhile, inflation in that time has gone up 22.24%. So we started out behind 14 years ago, and I'm sure, we have only fallen further and further behind in terms of how much we actually spend. Just to give you another perspective, if you look, here's a comparison of per student spending at school boards in the US. A lot of parents say to me, well, at least we're not as bad as the US, or, they're shocked when I suggest that actually Canada, the delivery of education here seems much, much worse. People are shocked by that. But then when you look at the per student spending, it doesn't seem that shocking at all. Canada, Ontario is like a third of what these other districts in some cases are spending. Boston is quite high, New York is quite high. LAUSD was my home district and the district where my kids did K through 6, my older one. And we were always called an underfunded district by national standards, right, at 18,000. And you look at Canada and it's well under that. And I think, honestly, the difference is apparent. Okay, so there's an analyst called Hugh McKenzie who's done quite a few papers for the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives. And basically, as I said, he was the one that flagged Ontario's funding, like tracing back to the Harris changes in the 1990s. We basically never recovered from that era. He calculated in 2009 that Ontario public schools were funded at levels behind 45 US states and 8 Canadian jurisdictions. So really, really towards the bottom in North America. Since 2018, the loss from inflation, I've seen competing numbers as low as 716 and as high as 1500. And the school boards, this isn't like for extras. It's not that they lack funding for kind of bells and whistles. This is really basic things that they lack funding for. They're having difficulty, for example, covering Canadian pension plan payments for essential school staff. Direct costs are not being fully funded. Okay, so it's important to note, I mean, people cite this 2018 number quite a bit because that coincides with when the current premier took office. But it's important to note that in 2017, the Ontario Auditor General issued a report calling for the revised school funding formula, and that has never been implemented. So these problems, yes, they definitely have accelerated in the last 6 years, but they really predated the present administration. So here's a little clip from the report. It says that the funding formula uses out-of-date benchmarks and is due for comprehensive external review. The task force recommended that the ministry annually review and update the benchmarks used in the formula and conduct a more comprehensive overall review of the formula every 5 years. 15 years later, there's been no review, right? So in 2002, there was some kind of review and there hasn't been one since. And so there's no accountability. This funding formula is completely a mystery. It doesn't seem to reflect the cost of things. There's just no accountability. And this lack of accountability has really given rise to dangerous conditions in our school. And when I say dangerous, I mean certainly dangerous for teachers and staff. This is an old article, but I imagine it's a similar situation. It says teachers tied with police and firefighters for most lost time because of work claims. So that could be because of violence in the classroom. That could be because of poor, conditions, like the buildings are falling apart and there might have been an injury. It could be because they don't have enough staff to manage the students. And so, for example, if there's a special needs student who might need, physical help, like to be, picked up, there may not be enough people to do it properly. And so someone hurt themselves. So there's many reasons why the conditions might be unsafe for teachers and staff. But it's also really dangerous for students. And I think parents need to know that there are 2 kids who have died from like in Ontario schools. They died either at school or directly after, following something tragic that happened during school. One of the students was this little boy named Landon Ferris, a 16-year-old with special needs in Eastern Ontario. He had a rare form of epilepsy that meant that, he could not be unattended. He had a high risk of dying during a seizure. And, unfortunately, for some reason, someone who was supposed to be watching him thought that it would be a good idea to leave him in this room, which is referred to as a sensory room. As you can see, it's a padded closet. I imagine this type of room might be used for kids who need a timeout, but I have to tell you, this is not standard practice. I mean, this seems very, very alarming and very strange. And honestly, it seems like something out of the Victorian era or something, because the standard in California, for example, you cannot leave a student like that unattended. You would never put them in a room like this. This is shocking. This is shocking to me that this happened. And this is what the room looks like. The other boy that died, actually, this one died earlier in February, was a 4-year-old in Brampton who choked on a grape at school. One of the budget items that has really taken a hit, at least in the TDSB, has been lunchroom supervision. Lunchroom supervision has been decimated and slashed, and to the point where my daughter's school, elementary school, had about 500 students, and there were only 2 lunchtime supervisors for 500 students, including, multiple classes of JK, SK. So when you have numbers like that and ratios like that, you can understand, you can begin to imagine how a 4-year-old eating lunch could die. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. I think both of these deaths, I don't want to assign blame to anyone who was there with them, but it seems logical, at least, that either or both of these deaths could have been prevented if there were simply more staff on hand. So this all, I hope this sounds alarming. I find it alarming. And you might be asking, is there resistance? Like, what are we doing to push back on this? I would say that the resistance to these worsening conditions have, I would say, mostly been led by labor to this point. But the labor campaigns tend to be very polarized. They use polarizing language. They focus on electoral partisan politics. So this is an example of something that just came out in the last couple of days. You can see they're making it like it's an ad for a new TV series, right? Ford High, the hottest ever, no AC because there's no AC. If you want to stream this in real life, just visit schools across Ontario. We've lost so much funding, it feels like something out of a TV show. Look, it's, they're trying to draw attention, they're trying to get a rise out of people, but unfortunately, I think my personal take is that they've been sort of running this same kind of playbook for 20 years, and it hasn't really gotten us anywhere in terms of progress. I would think that the people that they really need to bring into some kind of movement or of resistance are the people who don't necessarily consider themselves political, wouldn't normally go to a protest. It's people who simply just need to be made aware of how bad things are, not in a sensational way, but in a very, personal and, earnest way. I think that that's in my organizing, that's the angle I'm trying to take. Also, this emphasis on Ford, while it can be, again, sensational, it ignores the fact that actually, yes, the problems may have worsened under him, but the underlying issues and trends actually predated him. So just a summary of the structural gaps that I see. There's no national mandate for education. I think that, makes it as if there's no accountability in the provincial level, which is obviously bad. It can be misused very easily. There's a politicization of education. It becomes this partisan issue, not only with the labor unions, but also between the parties, right? It's like, more education funding is the issue of the NDP, right? And so the Conservatives have to naturally block it and resist it. This, I don't know why I don't know how it got that way. I don't know why that is. Education funding simply should be something that we're all concerned with. So that's a major problem. There's no single authority to blame between the school boards and the Ministry of Education. If you call the school board, they'll say, well, our two hands are tied. You need to contact the Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Education will say, well, you need to go to the school board because they're the stewards of, the funding, right? So, we get caught back and forth with no single authority. And that's why, some of us are advocating for a provincial takeover so we can have that direct line to the province. as radical as that may sound. No one with complete financial authority. There's this opaque and unresponsive funding mechanism. And there's no transparency to drive change. I didn't mention this, but I would say in the States, one of the key ways that I think progress gets made is that, there's like always this chain of lawsuits. And, in the States, the lawsuits, you can settle privately, but, oftentimes they go forward and the lawsuits are significant. And these high payouts really inspire, authorities to sort out the problems. And you don't have that here. Things seem to get settled. No one knows about it. There's no attention on it. And I think that's really detrimental to driving change. Okay, so education theory and history, it's easy to identify these problems, of course, but forming an opinion on them, on how things should be fixed, really requires an understanding of both history and social theory. Okay, so Albanese addresses what's the nature of school, what is it for? The kind of traditional way to look at it is the functionalist approach, which thinks of school as an ordered, functional, and balanced meritocracy that prepares children for the future. This certainly seems like what we're told school is supposed to be, or, the idea of what school is supposed to be. But conflict theory challenges this concept, and this is something you should be aware of. So Bowles and Gintis in 1976 saw school as not meritocratic, but rather a tool for shaping children to fit into the capitalist system. It's intended to create docile, obedient workers and reinforce class structure. IQ matters less than family background, right? That was their take. More recently, Holloway and Pimlott Wilson said, beyond the individual, neoliberal states seek to shape development of future citizen workers in new and expanded ways. So for example, through technology like AI, right? What is the worker going to look like in the future with AI? How is that going to, change us, right? I would say, again, this is me speaking as an STS person, tech solutionism, which is the idea that tech is going to come in and solve all of our problems. That aligns well with neoliberalism. I'm going to explain more what neoliberalism is. Okay, so to understand neoliberalism, we have to start with liberalism. I might shorten this a little bit, but anyways, liberalism began in the post-World War II era. It's a Western political philosophy that emphasizes an ideological commitment to human rights and individual protections, freedom, democracy, and that sort of thing. So under the mantle of liberalism, these multilateral institutions, again, that were formed after World War II, like the UN, like the OECD, those were actually established to further these democratic ideals globally. So you have then liberalism both domestically and internationally. But the problem with liberalism in both scenarios, both at home and abroad, is what do we mean by human rights? What do we mean by freedom? What do we mean by democracy? Those are concepts, again, like childhood, that are socially constructed and need to be challenged, right? Different communities may have different ideas of what that means, and so liberalism really tries to apply one grand narrative across, everyone, which presents challenges, I think. But even the social construction argument, even when you're acknowledging that there may be different ways that people understand those ideas, that even entertaining that discussion presumes that liberal actors are acting in good faith, meaning that when they say they are for human rights and for liberty and for democracy, that they actually want those things as opposed to just saying that they want them. So this is a major problem with liberalism. is that it says the right things, but it's not always underpinned by actions that are in line with those ideals. And so then that kind of raises the question, was there ever liberalism, or was it always this sort of neoliberalism that's a bit hollow? Um, I'm not sure the answer to that exactly, but one author who I really find very interesting is Giovanni Arrighi. He's an Italian economist who had an appointment at Johns Hopkins in sociology, professor of sociology. And basically, he, in his book, The Long 20th Century, he really describes how, using historical records, he describes how Truman, who was the US president post-World War II, coming out of World War II, never really had any intention of offering those things. Like those really were always just narratives. He describes how the liberal order, which is really predicated around this idea of the Americans as the good guys and the Soviets as the bad guys. He describes that as being basically an economic tool, a tool to foster essentially more defense spending, weapons sales. The European economy after World War II was completely decimated. They tried to sort of, make it work with just kind of OECD, kind of natural economic stimulation. It wasn't working. And basically they're like, okay, well, we need to make Russia the enemy and precipitate the Korean War. In order to kind of juice, the economy, not just in Europe, but around the world. And, that's more or less what happened. But, look, I'm not completely cynical. I think even though the US may have always just, used it as a tool, as a narrative, I do think there are many people in the world, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, who did buy in very, very strongly to the idea of the liberal ideal. And I think, that's probably why you saw a lot of progress, the progress that, that we did see in the latter half of the 20th century in terms of, civil rights and women's rights and all these, positive advancements in society. So George Monbiot, who's a UK journalist, and Peter Hutchinson just wrote a book they call The Invisible Doctrine, The Secret History of Neoliberalism. And in that book, they describe neoliberalism as the solution to global capital's democracy problem. So basically what they're saying is that coming out of World War II, you had these very nice liberal narratives coming out of it, but then at the end of the day, they didn't really comport with, essentially what is a more fascist trajectory. Corporations by their nature are fascist. Very rarely do you have a democratic corporation. There's someone at the top and they make decisions and everyone else has to follow. And so, corporations are by nature, they're fascist. And, the idea of the liberal democracy doesn't really align with corporate ideals. And so what Monbiot and Hutchinson are proposing is that neoliberalism emerged, to solve that problem. You could keep the narrative, but you could then have this framework that still benefited corporations. So basically, neoliberal ideology, it took hold in the 1980s via Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US. But it was based on foundational work by economists beginning in the 1960s. These economists linked positive trends in social measures like maternal and infant mortality, literacy rates, life expectancy, et cetera, to a high GDP. Their conclusion was straightforward, although problematic, right? Dubious. This was their conclusion. If you raise the GDP, you're automatically going to raise, those social measures. So they said it doesn't matter how much you spend or whatever. All that matters is a high GDP. If you have a high GDP, you're going to have high, high metrics, right? Social metrics. But, this it's really cut from the same cloth as the idea of trickle down economics, the idea that no matter what, if you funnel money upwards, it's always just going to help everyone, just sort of by association, right? It's the same idea. It's the trickle down idea. And trickle down has been debunked at this point. It hasn't worked. The rich have only gotten much richer. The poor have gotten much worse off. So, it's really the same idea. And, it's simply false. Okay. So remember earlier on, I mentioned the example of Canada versus Estonia. So now we're coming back to it. Okay. So just to show you how it's false, you can't just simply rely on a high GDP to, ensure, good social measures. So remember again, here was Canada versus Estonia, and the Estonian students consistently are performing, I don't know, between 15 and 25 points higher than Canadian students in the same respective socioeconomic categories. Okay, looking at GDP, Canada's GDP is 1.9 trillion as of 2023. Estonia's was only 40.7 billion. Okay, Canada's GDP is more than 40 times higher than Estonia's. But even still, our most advantaged students still consistently have lower scores than they do. Also, just to put it in perspective, Canada's education funding in 2021 was 4.1% of GDP, whereas Estonia's was 5.7% of GDP. Okay, so that shows you who is prioritizing education, right? It's not Canada. It's Estonia's prioritizing education by way of their, GDP, their investment, and it results in higher scores, right? The kids are better off. Look again, these poor Canadian students at the bottom are doing not so well. So this graph, I found it on the World Bank site, but I guess it's from UNESCO. This shows the percentage of Canada's education spending as a function of GDP. Okay, so here we are in 2022. As of 2022, we're, as I said, 4.1%, 4.1% of GDP. Look at where we've fallen from. It looks like the like maybe 90, 92, 93. Looks like 7.6% of GDP. Okay, that's tremendous. And then look how we've fallen. So this is quite sad. And, look, this explains why, for example, when I was, talking with people about the idea of moving to Canada, I know a few people my age, I'm in my 40s, I know a few people who told me, oh, well, luckily, the education system is really good in Canada. And, people who are Canadian, people who grew up here. And this explains, they grew up in the 90s, going to school in the 90s. Maybe they graduated, early to mid 90s. This is what the funding looked like. It was on this big upswing. And somehow it's like no one's noticed that it's been cut like nearly by half in terms of how we're prioritizing education. This is really sad. And again, I think it speaks to not having a federal, and there's no one at the federal level looking after education. The other thing that is really unfortunate is that the government, in a way, is like kind of incentivized to cut investment in social sectors, because doing so then leaves a gap for those private industries to come in and actually, in the short term, at least, increase GDP by establishing private markets and things like that. So that doesn't help, this fight for more education funding. So in general, I would say that neoliberalism is characterized by a long-term systemic shift towards the privatization of common services that were once completely privately funded. I would call it an invasive species. I would say, I don't know about Canada, but in the US, basically neoliberalism has totally replaced liberalism. I don't think I think, liberalism exists as a narrative only. I think which is why the US is having such problems. Um, and I would say at this point, US Republicans and Democrats align in terms of their neoliberal values. It's just really the social packaging that's different. Neoliberalism, okay, I want to be clear, it's not, and this goes back to why the labor rhetoric is like very problematic, because even though the idea of this trend towards privatization is a well-established trend, it absolutely is happening over time globally. It's something that definitely exists. The nature of the neoliberal ideology has become, like Monbiot and P. Hutchinson said, it's invisible. It's an invisible doctrine, right? People aren't even fully consciously aware that that's what they're working towards, right? Even if they're the ones who are actively, involved. I would say it's less a conspiracy of people saying, okay, we're going to do like XYZ, we're going to move towards privatization. It's more of a normalization, a normalized way of thinking that really just deprioritizes the public sector is really all that it is. It's epistemic, right? In the sense that it's a way of thinking that can be somewhat invisible to those who are involved. Okay, I would say domestically in the US and internationally, liberal ideology, as I said, it's been co-opted primarily to advance economic domination, right? So the language about human rights and freedom, it's become totally hollow. And it's really just about enrolling more people into, essentially a relationship of economic dominance over them. I would say that this is another hallmark of neoliberalism. Domestically, this is done by corporate actors, so through performative pinkwashing, greenwashing, momwashing, et cetera. So the idea that, a company like Walmart, let's say, they might have a day where all of their workers wear, rainbow shirts and it's like in support of LGBTQ people, right? But then, they're still paying unlivable wages to their workers, right? There's like the structural support for people is simply not there, but instead they're giving you this sort of marketing wash, if that makes sense. Internationally, the neoliberal Western hegemons utilize institutions like the World Bank, and the dominant hegemon is the US, right? But it's really all of the Western countries kind of working in alignment. But anyway, they utilize the World Bank, the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the OECD to actually actively spread these liberal norms. And oftentimes those norms work against a country's interests. So for example, austerity measures, which are, have been shown by research to be very devastating for a country's economy. But those are sometimes requirements of getting loans from the World Bank itself. Getting in, acceding to the global IP paradigm that can have negative economic implications for countries. There's still a kind of a neo-colonial relationship between the global North and the global South with respect to these IP patents, right? There's a lot of like, what are they called? Like patent licenses that are flowing, from the global South to the global North, and there's this active kind of trying to sell to the global South so that they take up these advanced technologies that require payments, these payments. So it's like it's all, even when it sounds really good and really exciting, it's like it's like bringing these countries into this kind of paradigm of dominance, right? Yeah, I was going to mention also adoption of embargoes. So for example, under Trump, he said, okay, we're not only is the US not going to allow Huawei, the Chinese company, to sell its equipment in the US, we're not going to allow anyone else, basically any of our allies, to do that either. And a lot of these countries are looking at it going, well, the Huawei equipment is cheaper and it's better and whatever. So, but because the US says that they have to have an embargo, then they feel compelled to do that. So, that's another example of how the hegemony can work against the interests of these individual companies. I'm straying a bit, but anyway, that's neoliberalism it's a global phenomenon, but it's also a very local phenomenon as well. So in summary, neoliberalism is characterized by the performative application of liberal narratives about human rights and democracy, while its decision-making prioritizes economic interests through short-term growth of private industry and thus GDP, usually at the expense of social infrastructure and human well-being. While the shift towards privatization is a distinct and undeniable global trend, use caution when evaluating personal intentions because neoliberal decision-making is often enabled and carried out by people who believe they are genuinely committed to human rights and or improving social conditions. Okay, so going back to some social theory, looking at Nick Lee, he describes a child-centered approach to education versus thinking of children as passive becomings, which is sort of like a more Lockean way to think about kids. Basically, his take is that it's the goal of education is to turn a diverse mass of people, individuals, into a homogeneous class of passive becomings. Children as sites of investment, not whole. So, look, to be honest, neoliberalism likes the passive becoming, right? They don't want independent, free thinkers who challenge ideas. That is very problematic, for the neoliberal ideology. Again, the alternative is the child-centered approach, treating children as social actors worthy of attention and given a voice in their own rights. If the child grows up understanding that they have rights, they'll be an adult who understands that they have rights. And again, that's threatening for certain actors. And the way this sort of neoliberal, these neoliberal decision-making plays out in our schools, in the lived realities for our students is very, very different for poor children versus affluent children. That was cited by, or that was McDonald, but I believe I took the quote from the Albanese book. So poor children are at a disadvantage for many reasons, one of which is the disadvantage that really begins in the home. Even before a child starts school, there's socialization that takes place at home, and particularly the acquisition of cultural capital for middle class and affluent students that is just not as present for or less resourced children. The idea around cultural capital is that everything that you learn in school, the way things are framed, the way it's structured, everything is really reflective of the preferences of the dominant power group. And so children who tend to have more resources, the parents are more attuned, the parents are better at succeeding, in this sort of structure. And so they begin to socialize their children early on. And so that can include things like learning musical instruments, paying for lessons, speaking in proper grammar, or, with in a certain cadence, or, without a certain accent, dressing a certain way, styling themselves a certain way, carrying themselves a certain way, casually interacting with important people. If you're a child in a home that's, very affluent, you may have, your parents have important friends that you might be around, from being a young kid. And it's like, being comfortable with those types of people is something that, it's not like you take a class about it. It's just something that some kids learn at home, and others, just don't have that same opportunity. The idea of going to a country club, and what that's like and how you interact at the club. And, those are things that, or the sport, the kind of networking sports like tennis and golf, these are things that, when you get to a certain point, if you are trying to exist in a certain world, it's going to be really obvious that you didn't have those things growing up. Like, it's hard to catch up. And working class kids, they struggle to catch up. The playing field is not level. So children in school, right? If they're disadvantaged, it's like they can barely turn around without being reminded that they're disadvantaged. Their gym shoes, they can't buy books at the book fair. They are ashamed of, their parents' job loss. They can't afford the field trip. They maybe can't afford lunch, or they pretend they forgot their lunch. Those are daily things that they have to navigate. Whereas, look, the advantaged student, just doesn't have the same concerns, right? They get positive interactions, daily reading, organized sports. And I don't mean to say that working class kids don't have positive interactions. I think that's actually not true at all. Sometimes it can be quite the opposite. But it's really more the material things, organized sports lessons, enrichment. It's just much harder for families to achieve those things for their kids. And then, kind of returning to the idea of those metrics we saw earlier about the PISA test, there is a huge difference between public school and private school. Private school kids score higher on math, reading, science. They have higher levels of educational attainment by age 23, higher socioeconomic family status for themselves. Public school kids are not on equal footing. They have a lower success rate, lower rates of school completion, which of course hinders success. So, those are kind of more obvious things, I think, but yeah, there's certainly a disparity. And as we saw, greater disparity in Canada than we would maybe want to believe. So when you ask teachers, actually what they want, what would help them, what would help their students, here are some things that the teachers said: inclusive curricula, improved staffing, reduced class size, professional development, more school resource personnel, higher school budgets, broader community connections, universal childcare, investment in social housing, improved healthcare, higher wages and labor protection. Okay, so these top ones are maybe more straightforward. The bottom ones are really reflective of a complex, system of social supports that go well beyond the classroom. Childcare, from before, well, it could be beginning before school age, but also after school care, potentially for school age kids. Social housing, it's very hard to do well in school if you are worrying about where you're living, or if you're in a space that's not safe or comfortable. Improved healthcare, if the child is sick and not getting the care they need, or if the parent is not getting proper care and treatment, that can negatively impact a child. And in terms of higher wages, if the parent is stressed and their job is unprotected and unstable, that's again going to cause a lot of stress for the child. So all of these things certainly relate to education, and they go well beyond the sort of Band-Aid, things we've seen recently. It's like, oh, we're going to send money for, to parents for tutoring, or, and it's like, these are Band-Aid things. Like, we actually need very comprehensive improvement in systems in order to really improve outcomes for students. Okay, just talking briefly about early childhood education. It's really, really important for our successful outcomes. Canada lags. It doesn't have a national childcare program. It lags behind other OECD nations in terms of enrollment in preschool. And however, Quebec does better than the rest of Canada. I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys, and these numbers are quite old anyway, but there's a lot more strain on households recently with inflation, with wages stagnating, debt increasing, costs of childcare increasing. All of these things place a lot of strain on families. And then plus, when the neoliberal, politicians make cuts to public services, that also eliminates good jobs. And so neoliberalism also, not only is it making costs higher, through privatization, but it's also reducing, these union jobs, Oftentimes they're being replaced with insecure low-wage jobs, sometimes gig economy type jobs. And a lot of women are in those positions and feel the brunt of that decline in, the quality of jobs available. At the same time, childcare fees have increased and regulated facilities have not kept pace with demand. It's very hard to find a regulated licensed facility. Grandparents increasingly are used for childcare. I mean, that has positive aspects, but I think it's very easy to imagine how a grandparent may not be able to provide, the materials and the stimulation and the activity, that really will help a child to have the best start. Okay, and then just to show this quality, in terms of types of care, not all care is equal. You can have custodial care that's just basically, supervision, like unskilled sort of supervision. You can have developmental care that is really attempting to enhance mental and social development. And you can have ethical care, which is, I would say the highest level of childcare. It's attentive, there's responsibility, competence, and responsiveness in the caregiver. Kids of all backgrounds do better in regulated care programs. Okay, so here's just a breakdown. These are a little bit old from 2017, but monthly costs of childcare in Canada's largest cities. So for toddlers, preschoolers, infants are usually very expensive. So let's look for an infant. In Quebec, as you can see, it's fixed. These numbers are fixed, quite low, under $200. Whereas in Ontario, it's quite high up for to care for, and again, this is in 2017, so it's some time ago, to care for an infant in Toronto, $17.58 per month. That's quite a significant amount of money. So this just really goes to show the fact that Quebec can keep these numbers so low. Just goes to show you that it's a choice. This is a policy choice. All of these outcomes for us that make our lives, a lot more significantly more difficult. These are policy choices, okay, made by people in charge. So my conclusion is that Canada's childcare and education systems are weak. Its score on international measures of child well-being are shockingly low. And I think more needs to be done, more needs to be spent on education in Canada at every level, preferably with some kind of federal funding backstop. We can't be held hostage at the provincial level if for whatever reason, government isn't competent or, interested in prioritizing education. I mean, that just cannot be the answer. I was looking at it last night. There's several interesting bills that have been proposed to maybe start to address some of these issues, but in general, it seems like there's a lack of political will and even a denial that these issues even exist. So I would say that more engagement is needed from the public to really turn attention towards this, to make education an election issue. And just for your information, one of the bills I thought looked really promising was this Senate Bill 282. So the Canadian Senate is like the high chamber. It's made up of appointed experts. The senator who introduced this bill was actually a pediatrician, a neonatologist at Sick Kids Hospital, Rosemary Moody. And basically her bill is an act respecting national strategy for children and youth in Canada. And it really tries to emphasize some of those provisions that were in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, to give more children more of a voice and more representation, and to take some of their problems more seriously. So anyway, that's a worthwhile bill, but again, it's originating in the Senate, which I'm not sure may put it at a disadvantage. But if you want to write in support of that, you can. I included their contact info here, and if you want to read the information about the bill, that is available also by link. And then additional actions, just in case anyone is interested, or if you have parents, if you have siblings who are still in school and parents who might be interested, I am co-leading a school board training session for an organization called Progress Toronto, which is trying to get more people involved in, kind of activism in Toronto. I'm co-hosting it with a current TDSB trustee, Matthias De Davidis, who's the trustee in Ward 4, which is like Jane and Finch area. And then also as part of my organizing, I'm launching actually this week a series of monthly actions, which I've called #Fund Every Penny for Student Needs. So you can either click on this link or use this QR code to access a messaging tool that will, if you put in your address, it will send the appropriate message. So we're going to do a message to Jill Dunlop, the Minister of Education, for the next 2 weeks, and then in November on to the Minister of Finance. And so we've got a little schedule for that. So feel free to follow along with that. So that's all I have, and I really thank you. If you have any questions, my email is on the syllabus, and feel free to reach out if you have questions or if you would like more information on organizing. I'd be happy to chat. Okay, thank you very much.